This episode of The Reality Check is brought to you by HelloFresh. Forget takeout. HelloFresh delivers all the ingredients for delicious, healthy meals anyone can prepare at home in less than 30 minutes. And HelloFresh is giving our Canadian checkers 50% off their first order. Go to hellofresh.ca and use promo code REALITY50 to get 50% off your first order. That's hellofresh.ca, promo code REALITY50. This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for Tuesday, September 5th, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Q-Woods?
Christina Roach.
Hello.
And producer Pat.
Hi, everyone.
But not as usual, we have a special guest, Dallas Card.
Hi, great to be here.
We have a great show for you listeners. Dallas is going to talk to us about biased algorithms. And then Adam is going to explore whether Lord of the Flies is realistic or not.
That's right.
But first, I'm going to look into where did summer go? How wistful. About 2 weeks ago, when the weather was a little cooler, I had this sudden and unhappy thought pop into my head. Summer is over. Now, of course, that isn't technically true, as summer will be over on September 22nd when the fall equinox occurs, but it felt like summer was over.
Well, in Canada, summer's like 2 weeks, right?
Yes. I had looked at weather forecasts into October, and it wasn't going to get any warmer. I then thought, where did the summer go? Yeah. Was this a misperception on my part, or were there decent reasons for me feeling this way? This segment will be a bit Ottawa-centric, but there are some generalizable pieces of info within, but not for all parts of the Earth, of course. I'll start with the amount of sunshine, and then discuss Ottawa weather. First, we are getting less sunshine. That's a fact.
Oh.
Tom Spears has a nice little piece in the Ottawa Citizen, linked in our show notes at trcpodcast.com, that explains Ottawa is losing more than 3 minutes of daylight every day. On the first day of summer, June 21st, Ottawa had 15 hours and 40 minutes of daylight, and by the time you hear this episode, Ottawa will have less than 13 hours of daylight. So that's 2 hours and 40 minutes gone. Spears usefully adds the reference of the smallest amount of daylight will be on December 21st at 8 hours and 42 minutes. Heading towards the darkness. Thus, there is certainly less daylight, but what about the type of light? The sun is not as high in the sky, obviously from an Ottawa frame of reference, as the sun is about where it always is in another sense. The sun peaked at 68 degrees above the horizon, if you imagine the horizon to be about 0 and 90 degrees to be overhead, and now it's around 50 degrees, and then it'll be around 21 degrees when winter starts. This means that the sun is still shining, but it is not as warm as it is more spread out from our frame of reference.
So you're saying that during the winter, the sun is only elevated 21 degrees out of a potential 90 in the sky? It's
Correct.
that much lower than it is during the summer?
Correct.
Wow.
Although even potential 90 might be problematic, but yes.
Sure. Well, it's never straight over, but...
not for us.
Not here.
Yes. Okay, so the sun, in relation to Ottawa and the Earth, is moving about like it always does, but that isn't enough to explain why I felt summer had disappeared this year differently than others. Acknowledging I had a busier time at work and thus less time to socialize, there's a more objective consideration: rain. Because human psychology tends to blend months together with the feeling of spring/summer/fall not always perfectly matching the calendar dates, let's go back to Ottawa spring. Again, Spears in the Citizen says, wettest May, wettest April and May combine, wettest spring.
Wow.
The Weather Office defines spring as March 1st through May 31st, by the way. They don't want to have to deal with mid-month issues. It's the rainiest first 5 months of the year. April brought 147 millimeters of rain, which was another record because the norm is 63. That's more than double. May had a record 175 millimeters of rain, more than double the average of 86. Wow. And the records there are going back to 1939, typically kept at the Ottawa airport. It was also cooler than usual, and a melting of a deep snowpack contributed to all the flooding Ottawa and Gatineau experienced early in the year. Okay, but what about key summer months? Turns out Ottawa had the wettest July on record also. CBC News states that 2017 was the wettest July, with almost 250 millimeters of rain falling at the Ottawa airport, most since about 1938 when they started keeping records. The average rainfall is 89 millimeters. That's almost 3 times as much.
Oh, yeah.
Furthermore, CBC states it was one of the coolest Julys in years. Ottawa didn't have a single 30 degrees Celsius day, which hasn't happened since 2009 in a July. To be thorough, though, and fair, August 2017 seemed in line with previous years, both in rain and temperature.
Okay.
So given the evidence of a wet, cold Ottawa spring and summer, and the more recently noticeably decreasing amount of daylight, It seems that my perceptual apparatus decently tracked reality when it felt like summer had disappeared. Although perhaps it could more appropriately be stated that Ottawa's 2017 summer sucked.
Well, it's not that summer went quickly, it's just that it started late. That's why it seemed short. So to say, where did summer go, may not be an accurate way of phrasing it.
Well, one could say all of those phrases are problematic. Summer didn't start late either. It started at the same time it did pretty much every other year.
The period of nice, dry, warm weather that we generally characterize as summer seemed to have started later this year. And that seems to be objectively true.
But if it started later, and then it didn't continue later,
yes,
then it would seem shorter, and thus less.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Adam.
So does that mean spring also felt long, but fall will feel the same?
Well, I guess long could be, gee, this rain is horrible, when will this end? There's a certain type of length there. But I think spring, we kind of expect the rain to have fallen. Not as much as it did, of course.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll have to check in with me in a couple months with my updated weather beliefs and forecasts. If a computer had analyzed the weather, they might also have thought it was terrible, but it might have been a biased algorithm. Dallas, is that a problem?
Good question, Darren. A little over a year ago, ProPublica released an article called Machine Bias with the following headline. There's software used across the country to predict future criminals, and it's biased against blacks. The article investigated a system called Compass, which is a criminal risk assessment tool sold by a company called Northpoint. The system is given answers to 137 questions, and returns a score from 1 to 10, which is supposed to reflect the likelihood someone who has been arrested will go on to commit a future crime. The questions ask about things like education, employment status, criminal acquaintances, and ethical quandaries such as, do you agree or disagree that a hungry person has a right to steal? The ProPublica article alleges that the system unfairly gives harsher scores to African Americans compared to white people. Others, including the company that sells the software, have disputed this claim, and this naturally raises the question about who is correct, what it would mean for an algorithm to be biased, and the nature of fairness. Now, obviously, the concept of race is complex and often problematic, but within the context of this article, people are classified into one of 6 racial categories, including black and white, and so those are the terms that I'll be using. In my experience, most people find the idea of an algorithm which predicts criminality to be somewhat concerning. And there are good reasons to be skeptical, partly due to Minority Report.
Great movie. And I totally disagree with the movie in that I think that would be a great system. Sorry, unpopular opinion, but...
I think it is, there certainly are reasons to be concerned, but I think it is worth spending a minute to take Adam's position and say what are the reasons for wanting this sort of system. First of all, we do know that existing judges are far from perfect. There's lots of variability across judges, and many presumably have their own biases. Second, although they don't make it explicit, judges are clearly using some sort of internal algorithm to make their decisions. We just don't really know what it is or exactly what information they're using. Moreover, it turns out that judges are not particularly good at predicting who will commit a future crime. Given that they presumably only receive limited feedback about their predictions, this is not surprising. At least in theory, one could imagine trying to create a machine learning system that would be more objective, more consistent, and learns from its mistakes. On the other hand, there are definitely good reasons to be skeptical. One of the biggest is that many of these systems, including Compass, are proprietary software products, with no way for anyone outside the company to know exactly how they work. Second, perhaps the biggest concern is that such systems may unintentionally be reproducing and systematizing existing biases. So training a machine learning model on skewed data will generally maintain or even exacerbate such biases, while simultaneously providing sort of an allure or veneer of objectivity. So what did this ProPublica article find exactly? Well, one of the coolest things about this story is that rather than just writing an article, the journalists actually gathered a data set, did some statistical analyses, and released both the data and the analysis online for others to explore. In particular, they didn't have access to the inputs to the system, but they gathered the risk scores given by the system for about 10,000 people in Florida. They then checked to see which of those people had subsequently been rearrested for a crime within the next 2 years. So the first finding was that black people tended to receive higher scores than white people on average. Moreover, this held true even when controlling for factors such as age, gender, and criminal record. Although this may be concerning, this is not evidence of bias in itself, as there could be other relevant factors which they didn't control for. Notably, the system does not explicitly use race as an input, but this doesn't really mean anything, as there could easily be other information which correlates strongly enough with race to act as a surrogate. If we look at the analyses done by others, including Northpoint, to push back against the ProPublica story, they mostly focus on the idea that the system is equally accurate across races. So in this case, accuracy is measured by the proportion of people who are rearrested within 2 years. As you would expect, as the score increases from 1 to 10, so does the proportion of people who are rearrested. And if you divide people by race, you find that this is also true within groups, and that the proportions of black people and white people arrested almost perfectly overlap. So for example, if you take all the people who receive a 5 from the system, about 50% of them reoffended within 2 years, and this holds for both groups. So that sounds like pretty strong evidence that the system is not biased, but ProPublica had 2 more very important parts to their analysis. First, they challenged the overall accuracy. So although the system seems to be well calibrated for a score of 5, of the people who were given the highest score, a 10, only about 80% reoffended. If we threshold people into high risk and low risk, the overall accuracy is closer to about 60%. And again, this holds if you split the population by race. So the calibration seems equally good across races, but the overall reliability is questionable. Moreover, the real issue concerns the question of false positives. Among those people who did not commit another crime, black people were twice as likely to have been classified as high risk. By contrast, among those people who did reoffend, white people were 70% more likely to have been classified as low risk. In other words, although it was equally accurate for both races, Compass seems to be making many more false positives for black people and false negatives for white people. So is it possible for both of these things to be true, or does this reflect a mistake in some of the analyses? It turns out that not only is it possible, it's actually inevitable. A subsequent paper from researchers at Cornell University proved that in the presence of unequal base rates, unless you can make perfect predictions, you cannot have a system that has both equal false positive and false negative rates across groups and is equally accurate for both groups. So to make sense of this, imagine trying to predict whether a random Canadian speaks French. If the only piece of information you have is what province they were born in, the best you could probably do is to predict that everyone from Quebec speaks French and everyone from other provinces does not. And although this might be relatively accurate on average, you'll be making different sorts of mistakes for the two groups. In particular, you'll be over-predicting French fluency in those from Quebec and under-predicting it in everyone else. So mispredicting French-speaking seems like a relatively benign error, but clearly releasing someone from jail is a much more consequential sort of prediction. And so given that the disparate impact of false negatives and false positives in these sorts of cases is so consequential, a group of researchers from Google have recently made the case that focusing on false positive rate is the more appropriate metric of fairness, and the one that we should pay attention to. Moreover, they actually have a way of modifying any existing system to enforce equal false positive rates. But of course, this will sacrifice some amount of accuracy and could be framed as a kind of affirmative action. So if any of this is still unclear, there's a really excellent visualization of this that I'll point people to in the show notes.
Well, it's not to say that affirmative action is necessarily bad in this case, if what it ends up doing is that it stops basically imprisoning more black people unjustifiably.
Absolutely. You could definitely argue that the system is, needs fixing on many different levels.
Yeah.
And I think it's difficult to think of trying to fix everything with one algorithm. But given that these sorts of systems will likely be deployed more and more widely, I think it's very important to understand the trade-offs that are involved and the different notions of fairness.
Truthfully, the scariest part of it is when it's a black box, right? As I mentioned at the beginning.
And even there, you could argue that an open source system would be more fair. Although in that case, it's still not clear how interpretable it would be to humans just because of the nature of machine learning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Moreover, that also raises concerns about gaming the system and so forth.
Right.
I think you raised some excellent key points there, Dallas, of what the trade-offs are and different notions of fairness. And that's more and more something I've come to think about, where everything has trade-offs, everything has pros and cons, and people have different definitions of fairness.
Absolutely. And it turns out that mathematically, some of them are actually incompatible with each other.
Yeah, but math, Math will tell you 0.99 equals 1. You can't trust it.
From a legal point of view, aren't there people that have issues with this? Why is my client... Why isn't my client being freed? Well, the algorithm said he was likely to reoffend. Why? based on what, right? Like,
Absolutely.
you kind of need something to back it up
Yeah.
based on our software output.
Yeah, no,
okay.
that has been an issue that effectively some defendants are not really able to access or challenge the evidence that's being used against them. Now, in theory, these systems aren't supposed to be used for sentencing decisions. It would be more for parole or bail decisions. But in practice, apparently they are.
If you're leaving this to be an arbitrary decision by a judge, that judge's brain is also a black box.
Right.
Exactly.
Right, yep.
And that judge can say whatever he or she wants to as the reason for the justification, and you could get the software to say that too. That doesn't mean that that's really the reason.
I was about to say that's a great point. Can you get the software to do post hoc rationalization? It's not plausible.
well, easily. Like here, these are out of the 137 questions. These 5 are some that I flagged as being potentially relevant as a reason I can give for not granting parole, based on my own research, the algorithms research or some AI research of what humans are going to find most convincing. Like you could do something like that.
Yeah, no, I really think it is important to emphasize that clearly judges are using some sort of algorithm, but determining what the right algorithm should be is far from an easy task. And even thinking about changing from many different biased algorithms to one algorithm to rule them all is somewhat scary in itself.
I think it's interesting that the idea of it brings the scrutiny, which should have always been there.
Right.
Absolutely.
As Dallas pointed out, another point that I always liked, it's like, well, how do we know there's not a mistake? You're like, right. How do we know what's happening now? And there's always something currently happening that people don't often evaluate enough when they think about the new thing.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, and going back to the movie Minority Report, like that was a pretty much nearly perfect system that really did accurately predict when people were going to do crimes, and they pretty much eliminated murder in DC in the film. But because of some inside problem, there was an issue, so they scrapped the whole program, right? And it's the same kind of idea. Well, there's this little issue, and it's not perfect. So do we scrap it completely, or do we try to fix it? And I could probably talk for another 20 minutes about Minority Report and how great that movie is. But,
And another segment and another show. Thanks, Dallas. While we're discussing different ways to implement notions of fairness and trade-offs of justice, obviously Lord of the Flies comes to mind. Adam, was that realistic?
Great question, Darren. One that's been on my mind for, 30 years. A new movie adaptation of the 1954 William Golding novel Lord of the Flies is in the works. The twist? It's all about girls. Many are taking issue with the basic premise of the film, stating that the events of the book, the resulting violent and savage behavior of a group of boys deserted on an island, simply wouldn't happen to a bunch of girls. This made me ask a simple question. Would it even happen to a group of boys? I read Lord of the Flies in high school, as many people did. I didn't care for it at the time for a simple reason. I just didn't buy into the concept. Basically, the idea is that if a group of boys is deserted and lacking any adult supervision or direction, they will become really terrible to each other. The gang's behavior deteriorates into a small-scale war on the island. In my youth, and probably due to some naivete on my part, I didn't think this made any sense. Now, with a bit more wisdom and experience, I look at it with a bit more nuance. I may have been succumbing to the myth of the noble savage. So this is the idea that humans devoid of modern social influence are inherently good and peaceful. This could not be further from the truth, as hunter-gatherer civilizations predating the formation of governments and other structured societies were severely violent and in a near constant state of warfare. Take a bunch of babies and have them grow up on an island, somehow not dying, and that is probably the state that they would revert to. But Lord of the Flies isn't about hunter-gatherers. It's about children from 1950s England who come from a society with rules, moral codes, and generally not running around trying to kill each other, then going to an island and changing. So what would a bunch of kids stuck on a desert island really do? Well, we can't be certain about this. It's never really happened. And we can hardly just throw a bunch of kids onto a desert island just to see what they do for the purpose of research.
Oh, why not? Come on.
Well, in 1954, in the very same year as Lord of the Flies was written, Muzaffar Sharif ran an experiment on intergroup conflict using 2 groups of 12-year-old boys in Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. 22 white middle-class boys were randomly assigned to one of 2 groups. They basically had the idea that they were being sent off to a summer camp, not knowing that there was another group. They spent a week bonding and establishing themselves within their group, doing camp stuff. And then they were informed that there was another group, and they were put into competition with one another. So first came taunting and name-calling, but then later things became more severe. One group raided the other's cabin, making a mess and stealing things. They eventually became aggressive and eventually needed to be physically separated from each other, so the experiment was stopped at that point. Things got pretty harsh. But Lord of the Flies isn't just meant to talk about boys, but society as a whole. It's meant to express tendencies that we all hold. So the question is, what would adults do in a similar situation? Surely many groups of adults go without outside supervision, but there's generally an expectation of eventual future reintegration with society, and this could be argued to be a reason for which people may continue to act with some level of civility. Otherwise, every time a cruise ship would go out to sea, we'd see similar breakdowns of societies just in the week or 10 days that the cruise ship goes around, and then they would come back to shore and be like, what happened? Why did a third of the people get killed and eaten?
To be fair, the buffets are taking care of a lot of that. There's a lot less energy and the drinks and buffet, people aren't doing anything.
To be fair, I've never been on a cruise, so I don't know what it's like. Now, the actions of the remaining crew of the HMS Bounty on Pitcairn Island seems an even worse example of behavior than what we see in Lord of the Flies. In 1789, so this isn't comparable to 1954 or modern times, but in 1789 there was a mutiny on the ship HMS Bounty. The mutineers set the ship's captain and 18 loyalists adrift. They did survive. 6 men, 11 women, and a baby girl settled on Pitcairn Island. They survived by farming and fishing for a time, but this didn't last long. 5 of the mutineers were murdered by Polynesian men who thought that the British crew members were treating them as slaves and taking their women. The remaining mutineers killed the Polynesian men. 2 of the remaining mutineers executed another for the well-being of the community. Only 10 years after the settlement, only 1 mutineer, 9 Polynesian women, and 19 children remained. So that went pretty south. It's not to say that the people who were doing the mutiny were maybe the best example of people that you can throw on an island, but these kind of things can go pretty poorly.
Sure, it's also not quite clear if what they were doing was wrong from the natives' point of view, and therefore the native attacks were justified, and then they had retaliatory attacks, which were, in their minds, justified.
But if they'd been in a city with police going around and government in place, would they have all killed each other?
Possibly, but less likely.
Maybe, yeah. So, and obviously, we can say that a lot of times people do end up in desert island type situations, and they don't always resort to killing each other. But so much to say, there is precedent, and this kind of stuff is deeply rooted in our psychology.
Yeah, it does seem like there are some counterexamples. I mean, the story behind Alive comes to mind, where after a plane crash, I gather people actually quite explicitly took care of the sick and injured, even though they're a liability. And
when I looked through examples, I found quite a few of these. And it was like, oh, these people were here and they were stranded in this situation, and no one died. Everything was fine. Everyone got through it. Everyone pulled through. So that's it's certainly not always going to happen. But it seems that, based on a couple of examples, a Lord of the Flies type situation is not completely unrealistic, and it is sort of based in reality.
Well, yeah, I think it's plausible.
Yeah. And unless we drop a bunch of kids on an island and see what they do, well, this is kind of a best guess of whether or not it's plausible. But ultimately, Lord of the Flies is a work of fiction, and there's nothing wrong with that. No work of fiction is 100% realistic, as an author is not tasked with running a hyper-accurate behavioral simulation of all characters when telling a story. Dramatic liberties are taken to serve the story. Similarly, an all-female Lord of the Flies need not be a realistic reflection of exactly what would happen if a group of girls were on an island. Still, it might be a poor movie if it simply depicted a bunch of girls acting like boys with an otherwise faithful retelling of the story. It would certainly be more interesting to see a story dealing with the social dynamics occurring between girls and how they differ from how boys treat each other or something like that.
That's okay, Adam. You can just watch the movie Mean Girls and you'll be completely up to speed,
That's a good point, but they don't kill each other. Now, with this new adaptation being written by two men, I'm not sure this is what we should expect, but time will tell, assuming the project isn't canned following the controversy that it's gotten already online.
Following this powerful segment.
We listened to the reality check and we decided we're not going to make the movie.
We're actually gonna bring Adam in as a consultant. You know, this remake of Lord of the Flies seems a lot like Minority Report.
Now, we don't need to get bogged down with realism in all works of fiction. There's certainly a place in books and movies for female action heroes, and we shouldn't criticize them for being unrealistic, as men are considerably more likely to engage in violent crimes or other activities. The recent success of Wonder Woman has been well received by many audiences. This is a female character created by a man whose actions may not be totally realistic. Some of her characterizations and actions may be more quickly associated with masculinity, but this doesn't diminish the character. It's still appealing, and it still makes for an interesting story and an interesting movie that people are liking. So realism aside, story can still be compelling and appealing to audiences for a lot of reasons. As female superheroes go, I prefer Sailor Moon, created by a woman, Naoko Takeuchi, and telling a story focused on the concerns of women and girls, but I don't pretend this story of a magical girl reincarnated from a princess who lived on the moon is realistic in any way. An all-female Lord of the Flies scenario probably wouldn't play out like it does in the book for a group of boys. It seems like the depiction of male behavior in the book does reflect reality to some extent. I don't have much in the way of expectations for this particular film, but ultimately it's a work of fiction, and realism isn't the only factor to consider. Let's not say it won't end up being terrible for a slew of other reasons.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks for joining us once again, listeners. I bitterly complained about where my summer had gone due to Ottawa rain and just the changing position of the sun in relation to Ottawa. Dallas gave us a nice exploration into biased algorithms and showed that depending on your definitions of fairness, there'll be problems that you'll encounter, and so there needs to be greater transparency or discussion of what those trade-offs are. And finally, Adam sort of looked into whether Lord of the Flies is realistic or not, and gave us some preliminary indications that, yes, it is plausible in the general sense. And Adam's going to watch the movie anyway, because that's who he is. And until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
Stay classy, not smartassy.
Good night, all.
Thanks for being here, Dallas.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
I hesitate giving Adam more airtime, but